Where do we come from? How did we get here? Humans have pondered these questions for many years. Now, science may be able to supply some answers. New advances in DNA are giving us fascinating information about the earliest peoples to arrive in Europe, where they came from and what they looked like. From the ancient hunter-gatherers who sought their food in the wild, to the first farmers and their extraordinary legacies. DNA research allows us to peel back the millennia and uncover new and unexpected tales from our ancient past. Here at Trinity College Dublin, an expert team is uncovering exciting new information about the ancient people of Europe. Scientist Lara Cassidy is at the cutting edge of modern genetic research. Through DNA analysis, she uncovers surprising and even shocking information about early peoples. Her work centres on the building block needed for the foundation of every human being, the genome.
Well, your genome basically is, in its essence, sort of like an instruction manual, containing everything you need to create and maintain a human body. So we have 2 copies of the human genome in nearly every cell of our body. We get one from our mum and we get another from our dad. So in that way, your genome doesn't just tell you about your physical characteristics, it can tell us a huge amount about ancient populations from which you descend. So this is the very first step. We need to actually source samples for ancient DNA analysis. And this is done away from the lab. So we go through lots of bones to reduce any potential contamination.
If you know someone's genome, you can sometimes tell something about their physical makeup, their eye color, their hair color, their pigmentation, other more important aspects like disease, height, for example. But also genomes tell us about how closely related people are to each other, how populations are related to each other. So it contains information about our family history or our population history.
It's prickly and it's absolutely critical.
Modern DNA can be sourced almost anywhere in the human body. But to find ancient DNA, scientists must use samples of one of the body's hardest bones, the Petrus, located at the base of the skull.
The Petrus is fantastic because of its density. At its core, it is rock hard. Some Petrus bones, they almost look like marble. The surface is a sheen. So this allows for good preservation of ancient DNA. And what we're going to do now is we take this and we put it in a solution that will dissolve the bone, protein, and collagen and release all of our DNA into the solution. Once we get that DNA isolated, then we can take it on and get it sequenced and actually figure out what the code of the DNA is. This here is our final product. We've purified the DNA from our ancient specimen and we're pretty much ready to go and sequence.
The actual sequencing happens in a lab in South Korea. Then the data is sent back to Ireland.
So we get the file back from Korea. It looks something like this. We have all of these very short sequences, and we want to take every single one of these little sequences and piece them all back together again to make the entire human genome sequence for this ancient person.
Lara has compared her results to the European Genetic Database, and she has found out incredible information about some of Europe's earliest populations. Some years ago, on a small island off the Irish coast, archaeologists made a fascinating discovery. Rathlin Island sits on the fringes of the North Channel, the strait that separates Ireland and Scotland. It's just 13 miles from here to the Mull of Kintyre, so it's no surprise that people have migrated across this channel for thousands of years. Almost certainly, the first people to arrive on the island of Ireland came this way by boat around 8000 BC. DNA analysis can uncover the origins of this island's early inhabitants. Local historian Mary O'Driscoll is fascinated by a recent discovery that presents intriguing new information.
In 2006, they were doing some excavations in the local pub in Rathlin, and they came upon a kist burial which had a body inside it and some pottery as well, and it was dated from the Bronze Age. It was quite exciting.
The Bronze Age dating means that the burials took place around 4,000 years ago. Archeologists from Queen's University Belfast rushed out to the island to investigate.
When we actually came out on the site, what we were met with was a big flat slab of stone. We can actually see into the section, we can see through a crack that we could see the burial and the pottery vessel in it as well. So we had a fair idea that was actually Bronze Age in date. It's very typical sort of Bronze Age burial, the way they used to do it, especially during the early Bronze Age, around about 2000 to about 1800 BC. So what we do, we just did a normal archaeology thing. We dug down, exposed the whole thing, and then we lifted the lid off the kist. And that's where my job really becomes a privilege, because you know that you're the first person in 4,000 years to see this site. You know the last person to see that person when they went into the ground was probably the family at the funeral. You know, and again, that is a privilege for archaeologists. The skeleton was in the fetal position, so he was crouched up with his knees up to his chest and his arms folded. We kind of think that this might represent rebirth. You know, that it's kind of like the baby would be in the womb. You know, and it's kind of like maybe, you know, this life has ended, so this is the rebirth for the next life.
He would have been between sort of 40 and 60 when he died, so that was a very good age. And he was about 5'11", and he looked like he'd had, from his bones, we could say he had quite an arduous physical existence. You know, he had lots of evidence of arthritis. He had a healed injury in his heel, so he must have, you know, had some sort of like an injury or fracture or twist on his ankle at one stage. And he even had sort of evidence in one of his shoulders, again, sort of suggesting very strenuous muscle use.
This Bronze Age man walked the island almost 4,000 years ago. But where did he and his people originate? The DNA locked in the man's skeleton allowed scientists make a thrilling discovery.
We sampled all the genomes we could get from these new sort of early Bronze Age kist burials, and yeah, what we see is the majority of their ancestry is coming from this steppe region of Russia, grasslands, where you have highly mobile pastoralists, sort of like think of maybe the Huns or the Mongols.
The Pontic steppe is a vast plainland region that stretches from the northern shores of the Black Sea through present-day Ukraine and Russia. The DNA analysis suggests that the inhabitants of this region migrated west across Europe over many generations, until at last their descendants reached Rathlin Island.
Migration theory, it has had sort of, you know, sometimes it's very popular in archaeology, and then there's been times when it's been quite dismissed, and people believe it's more a movement of ideas. But the DNA research is really showing that people could move long distances, and that they definitely did, you know, because we are seeing people moving as well as the material culture they bring.
We think of Rathlin as being on the edge of Europe, but this is only from a 21st century perspective. Thousands of years ago, it was once very much at the centre of things.
Rathlin Island was very important during the Neolithic period, and that's the period preceding the Bronze Age. It starts around about 4000 BC, right the way up until about 2000 BC. And the one feature about Rathlin Island is it's got an outcrop of a stone we call porcelainite. It's a lovely kind of dark bluish black sort of colour, and it polishes up really well. And during the Neolithic period, the stone was mined, it was shaped, and it was polished into lovely stone axes.
and then they actually exported them because there was evidence of these axe heads found in the south of England, in the middle of Europe, and I think as far away as Eastern Mediterranean. So they actually were in the export business.
These discoveries suggest that the story of Europe thousands of years ago is one of migration, of people moving gradually from east to west until at last they reached Ireland. But was this ever recorded in history? An old medieval manuscript held in the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin could hold the answer.
The Book of Invasions, or Leabhar Gabhála Éireann, is a compilation compiled in the Middle Irish period, perhaps around the 11th century, which purports to tell the history of Ireland from earliest times down to the time the Irish, the Gael, arrived. This compilation was compiled most likely in an ecclesiastical setting by learned ecclesiastic scholars well versed in the writings of the church in the Old Testament. It's a mythical compilation, and it gives various different invasions, accounts of the different people who are supposed to have invaded Ireland. Now, one of the great points of Christianity was the history of the world, the history as was transmitted in the Old Testament. There was one problem. It didn't mention Ireland or the Irish. So they set about putting this right and plugging this gap. And to do so, they concocted their own origin legend. And this purports to tell where they came from. And they used as a starting point Japhet, the son of Noah, and his descendants. And the Irish were supposed to have descended from certain of Japhet's descendants.
After the Great Flood, Noah's Ark is supposed to have come to earth on Mount Ararat in Turkey. So the legend in the Book of Invasions suggests that the Irish have their origins in the Near East. But can this medieval manuscript be trusted? It's written from a Christian point of view, thousands of years after the events it describes. Now, exciting advances in DNA are giving us the hard facts about these early inhabitants. Where they originated, where they migrated to, and what they looked like. This is Mount Sandal in County Derry, Northern Ireland. The Green Mound is all that's left of a medieval fort that once stood here. But long before that, during an era called the Mesolithic, Mount Sandal was home to a very ancient people.
Right where we are now is where the very earliest evidence of human settlement in Ireland was found. In terms of time, we're talking about 10,000 years ago.
A long-forgotten people lived here in a region of dense woodland and foliage.
I think you just have to look around you to get a sense of how much natural resources this place has. This whole area would have been covered in forest, so you'd have had wild fowl, boar, all running about, ready to catch and be eaten.
The early residents of Mount Sandal didn't understand farming. They got all their food in the wild by gathering nuts, berries and shellfish, and killing wild animals.
So these guys were hunter-gatherers. They probably lived in quite small groups. Population numbers were probably quite low. And this is really reflected in the genomes of these individuals we've sequenced. And they were very, very innovative. They really knew how to extract everything they needed from their natural environment.
Excavations revealed the midden, or rubbish tip, where they threw the remains of their diet, fish, fowl and shellfish. The hunter-gatherers were probably a small extended family group, and they appear to have occupied the camp for most of the year.
And just across the way there is the River Bann. You walk down it about 2 hours and you're hitting the sea and the estuary and that tidal zone, which has lots of lovely, yummy things to eat in it. Over 80% of the animal remains they found in this site are coming from fish. They were very skilled fishermen. We found very complex fishing traps in other sites like this in Ireland. Their ancestors were some of the first modern humans ever to set foot in Europe. And one of the last places they reached was Ireland.
Ireland was never isolated. From as long as we can tell, there was always connections between continental Europe, particularly Britain and France and Spain, when there was only hunting and gathering to sustain the population in the Mesolithic. The population maybe numbered around 10,000 people at the absolute most, maybe less than that.
The huts they would have built would likely have been covered with reeds or maybe animal skins. These hunter-gatherers, they're Ireland's most mysterious population. We know they were in Ireland for about 4,000 years, but there were very, very few of them. So they actually left very little of themselves behind, and Mesolithic sites are extremely rare, which is why Mount Sandal is such a wonderful find.
But Lara has discovered something even more wonderful. By sequencing ancient DNA from Mesolithic sites, she has reached back 10,000 years and revealed what these people looked like.
We've sequenced 2 first genomes from this Mesolithic period, these hunter-gatherers. Even though there's no population quite like them alive today, we can still try to predict maybe what they looked like or how they were. So one of the things we can do is we can take forensic techniques that allow us to predict skin color, eye color, and hair color and apply it to our hunter-gatherers. And we get a very, very weird profile. They seem to have quite dark skin and hair. It seems like blue eyes were quite common among these people.
For darker-skinned people to have blue eyes is really unusual. In fact, it's a genetic combination that doesn't really exist anymore. But during the Mesolithic era, pretty much everyone in Western Europe looked like this. DNA analysis of human remains from other parts of Europe has also turned up these genetic traits. These dark-skinned ancients inhabited Europe for many centuries, and yet their days were numbered. Around 7,000 years ago, a dynamic new technology appeared in Europe: agriculture.
Where we go from hunting and gathering to farming. And the big question for ages was this new people coming in, bringing these new technologies, or was it indigenous innovation? And what we see in this agricultural period, this Neolithic period in Ireland, is all our genomes are extremely different from the preceding hunter-gatherers. So these are people of very different ancestry, very, very different population history.
Something fatal must have happened to the hunter-gatherers, because little or no trace of the Mesolithic can be found in the DNA of modern Europeans.
The Mesolithic people were overwhelmed, and they were overwhelmed by a sheer weight of numbers. We can tell that there were many Neolithic people, perhaps tens or hundreds of thousands, who came to Ireland. And so the Mesolithic people, who were much fewer in number, died out. But you have to remember that Ireland's ecosystem is only capable of supporting a small number of hunter-gatherers. There aren't many natural resources to go around. When the Neolithic arrived, they grew crops, they were able to have many more children, fertility rates were higher. And so the sheer numbers of Neolithic people diluted the Mesolithic population beyond the limits of our detection.
The Neolithic farmers were sophisticated and imaginative. They buried their dead in extraordinary stone tombs, like this one in the Basque country of northern Spain. This is Chabola de la Hechicera, the hut of the sorceress.
We must remember that these are first monuments built by the people who inhabited these areas almost 6,000 years ago. And these are monuments for the dead. So it's something that they do for their ancestors.
Chabola de la Hechicera is a portal tomb. Huge upright stones support an enormous capstone.
Most of the dolmens in the Iberian Peninsula, they are all facing the eastern part of the horizon. This means not just east, but all the part of the horizon where we can see the sun rising from the winter solstice to the summer solstice.
The same design is used in other Neolithic monuments all over Western Europe. On the limestone landscape of the Burren in Ireland stands another haunting portal tomb, Paul na Mrón, the place of the sorrows. Under the shadow of this great megalith, the bones of the dead lay undisturbed for millennia. In the 1980s, archaeologist Anne Lynch excavated the tomb. What she discovered gave a fascinating glimpse into the lives of these early farmers.
This is a megalithic tomb built in the Neolithic or the New Stone Age at a time when farming was first being introduced to Ireland. In the 1980s, an archaeological excavation was carried out, and it's the material recovered from this excavation that has given rise to a lot of new information about these early farmers. The tomb consists of a single chamber covered by a very large sloping capstone. To our surprise, the remains of at least 36 individuals had been interred within the tomb. The bodies were interred whole within the chamber, allowed to decompose, and then there was a lot of manipulation, movement and removal of bones over the centuries. We were able to date the bones shortly after 4000 BC.
More than 30 years after the excavation, DNA analysis has given an unprecedented insight into these people's lives.
The discovery that ancient DNA can actually be extracted has been extremely exciting for us archaeologists. And to know that here in Paul na Mrón, bones that date to around 3800 BC still have within the Petrus bone of the ear very, very well preserved DNA. They're beginning to isolate diseases. We know that they suffered very badly from osteoarthritis. They had broken foot bones, presumably from falling and dropping stones on themselves here in the Burren. And there was a very poignant result in that one of the very young children was a Down syndrome child. And this is the first time, or the earliest example of Down syndrome to be recorded as far as we're aware.
The DNA also revealed something unexpected. The people buried here were not related to one another.
Originally, when we excavated the tomb, we assumed it was a familial tomb, a tomb used by an extended family who settled here in the very early Neolithic. However, the ancient DNA analysis has told us something completely different. In other words, that there was no genetic kinship between the people whose remains were put into the tomb. So now we know that it must have been the focus for outbreeding communities in this general area. So that was a very big surprise for us as a result of the ancient DNA analysis.
Different tribes and communities must have come to Paul na Mrón to bury their dead in an elaborate ritual. This is the kind of knowledge that only DNA can reveal.
The work is continuing, and I think with this collaboration between the archaeologists and the scientists, we'll be able to learn a lot more about these early farmers.
The people who built Paun na Mróin had a far more complex culture than the hunter-gatherers who went before them. But questions still remain unanswered. What did they look like, and what did they believe? At the opposite end of Ireland, near Belfast, lies a mysterious Neolithic enclosure known as the Giant's Ring. Dr. Rowan McLaughlin of Queen's University Belfast is an expert on the early farmers who built it.
The Giant's Ring is a monumental enclosure. It involved in its construction thousands or maybe even millions of hours of heavy labour. And so that was an activity that involved a lot of coordination amongst the society. In terms of what it was used for once it was completed, that is more conjectural, but we can speculate. Because the Neolithic is all about communal action. You can imagine a large number of people perhaps telling each other stories or performing. And the activities that went on here would have been the thing that really bound Neolithic society together.
Scientists use many techniques to reconstruct a picture of these ancient farmers.
We excavate as archaeologists, we physically dig up the evidence. And then that evidence gets subjected to all different kinds of scientific analyses. Now, the most important one of these is dating. Radiocarbon dating enables us to understand when things happened, how long ago that occurred.
Scientists can also analyse chemicals in bones and teeth to work out where people lived and what they ate. The DNA locked inside the bones give an insight not only into their ancestry, but also their relationship with one another. The charcoal samples can be examined to identify what sort of trees and wood they used for fuel and construction.
Yes, definitely going. Seems to just be a little too movement.
They grew cereals, they grew wheat and they grew barley, and they brought with them domesticated animals, cattle and sheep and goats and pig and red deer as well. So they had the skills to look after these animals. They had the capacity to fertilise the soil and grow the cereals. And they also brought with them a new set of material culture, different tools, polished stone axes, and crucially pottery. And that enabled them to cook their food and to store their food and to transmit their food from one place to another. So they are radically different life way from the hunter-gatherers that lived in Ireland before the Neolithic.
In the 19th century, a human skull was discovered near the Giant's Ring. Today, she is known as the Balnahati woman.
Somewhere around here, we're not quite sure where, in 1855, that's where she was discovered. She was part of the Neolithic culture. She was an adult woman who lived her life here in County Down.
The Balnahati woman gives us an extraordinary insight into the Neolithic community. Eileen Murphy is an osteoarchaeologist at Queen's University Belfast.
I'm interested in the study of the people who lived in the past, and I learn more about them from looking at their skeletal remains. So if it's an adult, I can tell if it's a man or a woman, what age they were when they died. And I'm also interested in things like the diseases they suffered from and, evidence for injuries. This is the skull of a young woman who was found in Ballinahati in County Down. She was found from quite an unusual subterranean tomb. When they lifted the capstones, they found this beautiful circular subterranean structure, and you can see it's divided into compartments. And in each compartment there were bits of pottery, remains of pots, burnt bone, and then in compartment D there were 5 skulls. So she was one of those skulls. She would have been stored in the Ulster Museum and in Queen's over the intervening time period. So at the time, You know, the anatomists who looked at her, you know, they were able to recognise that she was, it was a skull of a female. And my sort of osteological work, you know, more recent times has confirmed that. You know, you can see she's got very sort of straight forehead and petite, you know, because that's one of the ways we can tell whether we're dealing with a male or a female. So you look at this is called the mastoid process, and you can see hers are very small, whereas in a male it'd be much larger. And her skull is very rounded. Whereas again in a male it'd be much more powerful and robust, you know, with the muscle attachments. And we were also then able to say, you know, she was a young woman when she died, and we can just look at the sort of the wear patterns on her teeth. So you can see her molars. There's very slight wear, so that was sort of suggestive that she was a woman, you know, about 18 and older, you know, between 18 and 35. This is a facial reconstruction of the Ballynahati woman. So this was undertaken several decades ago. You know, the beauty of facial reconstruction is it gives us an impression of what the person was like and help remind us that it's not just a skull, it's the remains of a young woman. So that was the story up until very recently. And then the sort of the DNA technology came on so far that it's now possible to learn a lot about prehistoric people.
With the Petrus bone of the Ballynahati woman completely intact, the skull was sent to Trinity College for DNA analysis. When Lara Cassidy carried out the sequencing, she discovered something unexpected. The Ballynahati woman's ancestry was from the Mediterranean. Further DNA evidence showed that the ancestors of Ireland's Neolithic people came from the Fertile Crescent. This is the section of the Middle East where farming originated. Around 5000 BC, they spread right around the Mediterranean and headed north, crossing the Alps, arriving in France and Spain around 4500 BC. And a few hundred years later, they finally reached Ireland. So when the Book of Invasions states that Ireland's early populations originated in the Near East, it's surprisingly close to the mark.
We came by boat from Britain and from continental Europe. We have found actually some dugout canoes, these large trees that were hollowed out and made into boats. So they came over, and they also had to bring with them their animals, and that would have been an extraordinary event, trying to bring over to Ireland, you know, sheep and goats and calves. There could have been up to 1 million people, a huge population.
When we compare our farmers to modern-day Europeans, what we see is they don't look like the modern-day Irish or indeed any Northern European. They look more like Europeans from the south, particularly Sardinia. They're not only similar to Sardinians across the genome, they're also similar in terms of physical appearance. So we're seeing a lot of variants involved in dark hair and brown eyes and sallow skin.
When farming spread west over Europe from the Middle East, it brought with it a new dawn. People no longer had to move around in search of food. Now they could settle down with their crops and animals. Their most hallowed temples marked key moments in the agricultural cycle. Near Leipzig in eastern Germany stands a circular structure that may be the oldest solar observatory in the world. Gossek's Circle was built around 5000 BC by the earliest Neolithic farmers to live in this region. It's made up of 3 concentric circles. 2 of the entrances are aligned precisely with sunrise and sunset on the winter solstice. German archaeoastronomer Michael Rappengluck has studied the site.
People were very excited in the field of cultural astronomy because it is so old, and it shows that astronomy played an important role several thousand years ago. The people looked upon the sky, they saw the sun rising and setting, and they also saw the places of the sunrise and sunset, and to rely a calendar, time reckoning, on these places of sunrise and sunset.
The sun was worshipped as the giver of life and the orchestrator of the changing seasons, with the observatory likely playing a key role in man's understanding of nature.
Also, there was a relation to some fertility rites, rituals, to some ideas about new life, about the old year, the new year, and so it played a very, very important role in the ancient cultures. The leaders, I think, they had the idea of showing the people some ideas about the cosmos, and it has something to do with power. The leaders know where the sun is rising up, the exact points, they know the calendars, they know all the things to manage time, and probably also other things, let us say, to orientate in the landscape, and so they had power. And for them, such things had been a kind to show the power.
This is a relatively simple structure, built of wood and mud. But over 1,000 years after it was built, the Neolithic culture would construct greater and more impressive temples, with the dual function of solar observatory and tomb. "30 miles north of Dublin, tucked inside a bend in the River Boyne, lie two of Europe's most magnificent ancient monuments. The huge burial mound of Newgrange, and close by its sister tomb, Knowth. Older than Stonehenge, they were built by the first farmers.
Newgrange was built coming up to around 3000 BC, one of the three mega passage tombs in Brú na Bóinne. In recent years, we've discovered underground evidence or crop mark evidence of huge enclosures within Brú na Bóinne, where large assemblies must have taken place. You had the astronomical alignments on the winter solstice. You have a wonderful megalithic art in the tombs in Brú na Bóinne. So you're talking about a much more sophisticated community and society.
The tombs are among the greatest achievements of the Neolithic people in Europe. They contain extraordinary clues to their culture and beliefs, ones that have yet to be deciphered. More than half of all of Europe's Neolithic rock art is found at Newgrange and Knowth. Excavations so far have uncovered over 200 decorated stones. But what do the symbols mean? Could they be cryptic references to a mystery that scientists have only just uncovered? At the time of midwinter, this part of the world is at its greatest distance from the sun. From now until midsummer, it will draw closer to the sun. Life will be renewed and the crops will grow again. At Newgrange, on the shortest day of the year, the sun's rays blaze through this small opening, illuminating the narrow passage and the central chamber deep within. The passage travels 62 feet until it ends in a chamber deep in the centre of the tomb. This is the most sacred part of the entire monument. When archaeologists excavated Newgrange some 50 years ago, they found many human bones in this central chamber. For many years, science was unable to tell us much about their owners. But Professor Michael O'Kelly kept a detailed record of these human remains. His work gave Lara Cassidy the means to uncover a 5,000-year-old secret.
So this is Michael O'Kelly's book on the Newgrange excavations, and going through it, we've actually got these pictures of the human remains found there. And inside we see this picture of this pair of Petrus temporal bones that look absolutely perfect for analysis. So we saw these and we thought, we gotta have them.
Petrus bones are ideal for sampling human DNA. And it so happened that when O'Kelly excavated Newgrange, he found 2 Petrus bones in the most sacred part of the monument.
The next big step was actually locating them.
In the National Museum of Ireland's storage facility near Dublin, the shelves are lined with boxes and boxes of finds from around the country. It was over 30 years since the publication of O'Kelly's book, and there was no telling whether Lara would be able to locate the bones.
A lot of the bone tends to be cremated, which is no use to us because cremation destroys all DNA. But we couldn't find anything from Newgrange. A bit sad about this, but towards the end of the day we actually did find one box, but it had just brackets cremation on it, and we thought, oh, more cremated bone. Almost didn't look in it, but thought, oh. Popped it open, what do we find? Our pair of Petrus temporals that we'd actually seen in the book. Applied and we sampled one of them. We started to do our basic analysis. He was looking the same as all the other Neolithic farmers. But then something really weird came up. You have 2 copies of the genome, one from your mum, one from your dad. What happens if your mum and your dad are related? Is that those 2 copies of the genome are gonna look very similar. And the level of this similarity tells us how closely related your parents were. And this guy, honestly, I thought there was something wrong with my analysis because he was off the chart. But it was actually correct, and we decided to try and measure the degree of this relationship, and it turned out his parents were actually either siblings or parent and child. So, first degree incest.
Newgrange was the most sacred place in Ireland and possibly in Western Europe. Lara Cassidy's discovery could change everything we thought we knew about religion in Europe 5,000 years ago.
He was so inbred that the inescapable conclusion is that his parents were either brother and sister or parent offspring. Now, that's pretty crazy, and that is not normal. And not only is it not normal in our society, it's not normal in any society. It's a universal taboo. The story, whenever you give somebody a very high rank, who is the offspring of brother-sister, is that the rank of these people is perceived to be so high that other people are unworthy. That their rank is such that they're almost gods, or they are perceived as gods. So normal rules don't apply.
Could this really be a sign that the man was revered as a god? To answer this question, we need to travel to the region where the Neolithic people originated, the Middle East and the land of the pharaohs. From Ramses the Great to Cleopatra, the kings and queens of this ancient land ruled supreme. History tells us that in ancient Egypt, kings frequently married their sisters. Brothers and sisters wed and then lay together. And these unions were seen as something that brought good luck to the kingdom. The pharaohs believed they were descended from the gods, and so inbreeding was crucial to preserve the bloodline. Could similar attitudes have existed in the ancient Irish site of Newgrange? What we know about ancient Egypt makes us look at Newgrange and the early farmers who built it in a whole new way. Is it possible that the tomb was built by a royal figure who treasured the fact that he was the offspring of incest? Did he see death as a phase in which he transcended to the gods? Whatever the answer to these questions, the discovery suggests that Ireland's first farmers had the same beliefs as the ancient Egyptians. These beliefs may have existed elsewhere in Europe.
Throughout Europe, Neolithic culture shares certain similarities. So this idea of communities coming together to perform in spaces out in the open is something that's shared. So in Ireland we have enclosures and we also have megalithic sites made of large monuments. Similar things are found in Spain and in France and right around the periphery of the Neolithic world. In Malta, for example, there are megaliths that in many ways resemble sites in Ireland. Temples where people came together and performed and told each other stories, celebrated the agricultural year and enabled their Neolithic culture to thrive.
This is the great temple of Durantia on Malta's sister island, Gozo. It was built around the same time as Newgrange, and on the day of the winter solstice, just like Newgrange, it would have been the scene of great celebration, as the morning sun shone directly into the temple. Did the Neolithic people of Malta share the same beliefs as their far-flung cousins in Ireland? Right now, no one knows for sure. But in time, science may reveal more. What happened to the intriguing people who left this extraordinary legacy? Was it climate change? A devastating epidemic? Or a cataclysmic event that saw the demise of the Neolithic farmers?
We actually don't quite know. Could be a combination of factors. You could have had new diseases being introduced that European farmers weren't immune to. You could have a climactic downturn or something. If the crop fails a few years in a row, that can cause havoc in an ancient civilization.
Whatever the cause, around 2300 BC, almost 1,000 years after Newgrange was constructed, the Neolithic people died out. Modern science has given us a window into their world and how it might connect to ours.
It's through DNA that we know the Neolithic people are the direct descendants from those residents of the Near East 10,000 years ago. And the DNA is also telling us who our modern day ancestors are. And there's very, very little of the Neolithic that remains in us.
Instead, people in northwestern Europe are more closely related to a Bronze Age population who moved west across the continent over 4,000 years ago. And yet, the first farmers have bequeathed a great legacy. Passage tombs like Newgrange are found not just in Ireland, but all over Western Europe. Now, DNA research has given us a fascinating insight into what the builders of these tombs believed. It seems they thought that the man buried at the centre of Newgrange was nothing less than a god. a spine-tingling revelation that totally changes how we look at these places. These tombs are among the most sophisticated ancient structures in all of Europe. There are undoubtedly more secrets hidden within them, and in time, science can help us reveal them. History is filled with stories of great people, from kings to freedom fighters. But the records don't tell us much about the day-to-day lives of ordinary people. They don't tell us how they dealt with one of the greatest transformations in history, the rise of Christianity. But now, exciting new discoveries in DNA, science, and archaeology are filling in the gaps. They reveal that pagan practices continued for centuries after the coming of Christianity. Across Europe, many feared dark supernatural forces and the return of the dead. In the last 10 years, new advances in science and technology have enhanced our knowledge of the past like never before. Some of the most exciting research is in the field of genetics.
Our genome is the sum of all our genes. It's the sum of all the DNA that we have in our cells. And what that contains is the blueprint for the organisms that we are.
Using human remains from hundreds and even thousands of years ago, scientists can sequence the DNA of long-forgotten people, revealing fascinating information about how they lived and died.
We start from scratch. We're trying to look for good samples that we're likely to get DNA out of. What we have to do is we have to ask archaeologists what sites are good, what sites are interesting, what questions should we even be asking.
When it comes to the medieval period, with the building of roads and things and cutting across huge swathes of land, we have found dozens and dozens, hundreds of sites that we never knew existed before.
One of the most intriguing sites is located on the shores of Lough Key in the west of Ireland. This area is cloaked in myth and legend. Once, it was home to some of the most powerful clans in Ireland. Recent archaeological finds here cast light on the early medieval period, a time of major change and transition. St. Patrick brought Christianity to Ireland in the 5th century, but people didn't become Christian overnight. It took a long time for them to surrender their old rituals and beliefs. 1,000 years ago, this island was called the Rock of Lough Key. From here, a family called the McDiarmidis ruled much of the surrounding territory. Like other Irish lords, they worked hand in hand with the Christian Church to establish the new faith.
And one of the greatest events to happen in early Irish history was the advent of Christianity, because Christianity did not just introduce a new religion, but it brought with it a complete culture of the Christian world.
Patri, et Filii, et Spiritus Sancti. Amen.
It influenced every aspect of life and influenced Irish thought in particular. And of course, the other thing that Christianity introduced to Ireland was writing and reading, and this was a new technology. And once the Irish started to write, they continued writing and produced vast amounts of material during the period sometimes referred to as the Dark Ages in Europe.
fascinating evidence of this story was preserved here on Trinity Island on Lough Key. The island is now deserted, but these trees hide the remains of what was once a place of great learning and scholarship. At the Monastery of the Holy Trinity, the McDiarmidis sponsored an order of monks to take up residence and compile the historical records of the area. Living under strict rules of poverty, chastity and obedience, the monks chronicled events of major importance on a year-by-year basis. These records belong to a great body of literature known as the Annals.
We are lucky in Ireland. We have a massive collection of annals. The annals are so called because essentially they recorded events on a yearly basis. The big events such as deaths of major people, reigns of kings, battles and extreme weather.
The rock of Lough Key was burned by lightning. 60 or 70 of distinguished persons were destroyed, along with 15 men of the race of kings and chieftains. There escaped not alive, but Cruchur MacDiarmida, with a very small number of the multitude of his people.
The monks were bilingual. They wrote in Gaelic when recording local Irish history, and in Latin when compiling details about the church, its bishops and its popes.
It seems that from a very early stage, the elites and the church leaders worked very closely together. Even just by the wealth of the church that we see as early as the 7th century, we can see that they gained such a foothold in society because they worked closely with the current power structures.
I would ask a blessing.
There is certainly evidence in terms of how Christianity was introduced and spread across Ireland, and it would be a tactic used by St. Patrick and others who were spreading the gospel to try to convert the leaders, the clan leaders, the kings, because if they could convert them, it would follow on fairly quickly that their subjects would take up the same religion as their leaders.
For many years, the monks chronicled major events, not just around Lough Key, but all over Ireland. They left an incredibly rich source of medieval history. But whose history is it? Scholars are beginning to understand just how one-sided the annals were. The affairs of the church and the powerful ruling classes make up most of the entries.
Corpus Christi, nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritus Sancti.
A strict class system shaped medieval society. There wasn't a lot of social mobility, but what was important was one's position within this hierarchy. For the elites, land, ownership, and territory defined one's status. But these records don't actually tell us much about the ordinary people. They don't tell us how much or how little they subscribed to the new Christian faith, or how they lived, what they ate, who they loved, and how they died. Canadian archaeologist Chris Reid is on a mission to uncover their story.
I was always fascinated by certain elements of the past and I suppose about the human condition, particularly things like religion and ritual and the kinds of things that people believe, and wanting to, I guess, figure out where all that came from. And archaeology seemed to offer the best chances to answer some of those questions I had. The underclasses of the population, they're pretty invisible in the histories, and I guess that's where archaeology gets to lend, I suppose, most to the story of the past, is we get to flesh out the lives of regular people. So when we're actually excavating say, an early medieval cemetery, we're actually looking at the bodies of the people who lived in this place during that time, and we can tell a lot about how they lived and what their health was like and what sort of, traumas and diseases they might have been having to deal with.
Around 10 years ago, Chris Reid led a major archaeological dig on the shores of Lough Key.
It was a medieval excavation, I suppose, covering a time span from about 700 AD to 1400 AD.
The site contained the remains of as many as 3,000 humans. From these, Chris and his team managed to recover a total of 137 skeletons.
We are looking at a period here which is only a couple of hundred years after the establishment of Christianity in Ireland.
Chris's discovery has given us a fascinating insight into life and death in medieval times. Although people were nominally Christian, they followed very ancient rituals when they buried their dead.
The general rule is that when a Christian person is buried, that there's no putting in of grave goods or offerings, things for the afterlife. But one thing that we found throughout all of the burials across the period were quartz pebbles. They came in large and small format, and we literally collected all of them that we came across. They're prevalent everywhere in the soil, but we certainly found greater concentrations in the burials themselves.
What the quartz stones signify has been a mystery to archaeologists for some time. But one thing is certain. This strange practice goes back thousands of years into prehistory. It evokes a forgotten religion that was cloaked in power and mystery.
In Ireland, we have the Neolithic passage to Newgrange, which during the excavation, they found a huge amount of large quartz pebbles outside the entrance. This very, very, very special site, which is quite deliberately, through its alignment with the rising sun at the winter solstice, associated with the light. And I think that's possibly the magical connection with quartz, is that it seems to be symbolic of light. So if you go visit any cemetery in Ireland and you look at the rectangular grave plot as it sits in front of the headstone, you'll see white glass chippings. Why are people covering the graves with these shiny white stones?
We don't really know what the meaning of quartz pebbles are when they're interred with a body. It would have been quite a normal thing in pagan Ireland to put grey goods in with burials. But in the Christian tradition, that is kind of frowned upon. It's not really a done thing. So to inter these small natural pebbles within a grave may have been a way of circumventing the laws of the time or the incoming burial rites of the time.
Did the coming of Christianity sever the connection to these ancient beliefs? To answer this question, we must explore a decisive event in medieval history, the mission of St. Patrick. As the patron saint of Ireland, Patrick needs no introduction. His feast day, on the 17th of March, is celebrated by colourful parades all over the world. Patrick came to Ireland in the 5th century AD. According to the traditional version of events, he travelled around the island and eradicated the old pagan beliefs, replacing them with Christianity. Afterwards, Ireland became the land of saints and scholars. But as historians now understand, that's not exactly what happened.
One of the main things that they probably objected to were the Druids and the teachings of the Druids, specifically about gods and things like that, and the rituals and sacrifices, ceremonies, those kinds of things that the Druids did. By the 7th century, we have the Druids losing their status and being very much peripheral figures, kind of like witch doctor kind of characters, whereas once they probably enjoyed a very central role in society.
Here in Ireland, people worshipped lots of different deities. There were some larger national ones and there was local deities. So when another god sort of got added to the pie, it wasn't that big a deal. But the thing about Christianity is that it's monotheistic, there's only one god, and that over time the other deities were reduced down to mythical characters from times gone by.
This holy well in County Clare in Western Ireland is dedicated to the Christian saint Bridget. Her feast day is on the 1st of February, marking the beginning of spring. But originally, St. Bridget's Day was a pagan festival, dedicated to a pagan fertility goddess.
St. Bridget is a very well-developed Christian character, but her feast day falls on what was almost certainly a pre-Christian feast day, and there was a goddess known to the Irish and to the British as well, and possibly to the Gauls, who had the same name, Brigantia, the Exalted One.
The early church took ownership of the goddess and Christianized her, calling her Saint Bridget. Throughout the Western world, the church allowed many old pagan practices to continue under a veneer of Christianity.
There are some things that we know that have survived, at least thematically. There's the festivals of the pre-Christian period, things like Halloween, things like the 1st of May, Bealtaine. Those are important days in the year. How they were celebrated in ancient times is difficult to say, but I think the themes survive. And, you know, the theme of the end of harvest, moving from summer into winter, that's an important juncture. It's an important point for an agricultural people. And the fact that they celebrate that through feasting, and also this belief that the other world and this world are quite close at that time, is probably something that relates to the old religion that survived in folk tradition and in literature.
Rathcroghan in County Roscommon was once the most important royal site in the west of Ireland. Kings and queens were crowned here, and it's a landscape rich in myth and mystery. This ancient complex contains as many as 240 separate archaeological sites, encased within just 2.5 square miles. Traces of human settlement from as far back as 3200 BC are found here. In it is one of Ireland's most important prehistoric sites.
It's the royal site for Connacht. It's the western prehistoric capital in a sense. And the reason for it, in many respects, is very simply down to the quality of the land that's out there. So it's a limestone-rich plateau with a good soil cover, which is brilliant for raising cattle and for grazing animals.
On the top of this mound, it seems there was a building there which was probably a temple or a ceremonial space. You could imagine the king being brought up in a procession to this space, druids or poets maybe reading out their genealogy, presenting them as being this new king. You know, probably events that took place over a number of days or maybe more. The thing to think of when you look at this landscape now, it's quite bare. If you see a few sheep and cows, but if you can imagine it with thousands of people thronging this place, and once you bring in people and these high concepts, the landscape comes alive.
When St. Patrick went on his mission to Ireland, he headed for Rathcroghan. Its role as a gathering place went back for many centuries, as did its association with the local rulers. And eventually, these rulers embraced Patrick's Christian religion.
It's not a flicking of a light switch. There's a whole conversion period. And Patrick said to have baptised 2 daughters of the High King of Ireland, Eithne and Fidelma, and they're said to have been baptised at a well site on the eastern slopes of Rathcroghan. So the fact that St. Patrick is regarded as coming to Rathcroghan in order to baptise those of a pre-Christian faith, that action is perhaps a continuation again of the pre-Christian activity of assemblies, of gatherings, of fairs taking place at the summit of Rathcroghan Mound.
By the 7th century, we see in documents that the church was very sophisticated and very well organized. However, we also see that pre-Christian elements survived for many centuries after the formal establishment of the church.
In ancient times, people gathered on hilltops all over Ireland to celebrate a great harvest festival, Lunacy.
Lunacy was once a very widespread festival in Ireland, a festival in honour of Lugh, who was this important god to the pre-Christians. And this is the beginning of the period first of fruits are ripening, when crops will be harvested. There would be games, dancing, celebration. They may have drawn on ideas like fertility, images to do with fire, new life and growth. But when the Irish changed religion from paganism to Christianity, they had a lot of the same concerns. You know, whether you're praying to the pagan goddess or the Christian god, you would still be in spring concerned with food, you'd still be concerned with fertility, you'd still be concerned with making new beginnings and starting new life.
This great wedge-shaped mountain on Ireland's west coast was one of the most sacred ancient festival sites. With the coming of Christianity, the mountain became Croagh Patrick, a Christian pilgrim site. And St. Patrick took on the role previously held by the pagan god Lugh.
There are stories to do with Lugh about him defeating an older god and saving information to do with the harvest and how to have a proper harvest. And it seems that that idea probably got recast in a Christian sense for a Christian people who were celebrating this feast day.
And perhaps it's their attempts to try and change and try and bring the likes of these pre-Christian centres under the authority of the Christian religion.
It wasn't just in Ireland that pagan sites were converted to Christianity. The cult of the god Lugh is found all over Western Europe.
The whole of life was infused with spirituality, with gods and goddesses, with demons and all sorts of other agents of the supernatural. That's how they lived their lives.
Deep in the French Pyrenees stands the great medieval church of Saint-Bertrand de Comminges. Around 2,000 years ago, an invading Roman army occupied this region. They built a town here as a base from which to pacify the local Celtic tribes.
The name of the city is Lugdunum, which is a Romanization, a Latinization of Celtic words. Dunum means a fortification, a fort, and Lugh is the great Celtic god, the god of light.
Lugh was worshipped here in the Pyrenees, just as he was in Ireland.
We do think that there was a temple up on the top of the hill under where the cathedral is now, a major cult centre to Lugh in this part of the Pyrenees. But he clearly was an important Gaulish god, as well as in Spain. After all, the capital of Gaul, Lugdunum, the modern city of Lyon, was called after Lugh. So you find dedications to him all over the place.
Almost 1,000 years ago, the Christian bishop Saint Bertrand came here. Just like St. Patrick, he carried out a mission to Christianize the locals.
We're told that when Saint Bertrand was building the church, the people up in the Pyrenees, their religion was pretty dubious, and that he mounted a campaign of evangelization. In a way, that cathedral is that campaign of evangelization materialized in stone. People would have come from all over the diocese for the great festivals of the church. There's some evidence that people came from Spain. It's saying that Christianity, the true faith, is making its mark on everything. It has triumphed over the demons of paganism. The gods and goddesses are dead and gone, and that all spiritual power now rests with the church and with its representative, the bishop.
And yet pagan influences still lingered on. The limestone plateau of the Burren in County Clare is one of Europe's most distinctive landscapes. Deep in this stone wilderness stands the imposing medieval fort of Caher Connell, built around the 10th century AD. a massive circular dry stone wall surrounds the stone fort. Caherconnell is a prime example of the kind of circular fortification that predominated in Ireland over 1,000 years ago. And to this day, it remains a powerful and imposing sight on the landscape. The fort was home to an elite family, probably the O'Loughlyns, known as the kings of the Burren. But what about the ordinary people? They weren't buried in prominent sites. Recently, archaeologists undertook a full-scale excavation of another circular fort, the newly discovered settlement of Ranelagh, some 100 kilometres northeast of Caherconnell. Their work gives us striking new insight into the lives of the ordinary folk.
So when a road is planned, when a route is selected on a map, we have a variety of techniques available to us that let us locate the archaeology and identify archaeology along the route.
The archaeologists used drone photography to obtain a comprehensive aerial picture of the site and how the dig is progressing on a day-to-day basis.
But what we're doing now is we're using much more up-to-date techniques, much more scientific techniques to find out about the people who lived on these sites.
The excavations revealed a ring fort, the most common type of settlement in Ireland at the time. Ring forts were generally the homes of elite families, but the ordinary folk worked and lived alongside them. With the rise of Christianity, they found that the church played an increasingly large role in their lives. And yet, they had an entire culture of their own that had nothing to do with the Church of Rome. The archaeologists uncovered evidence of not one, but 3 ring forts, each one encircling the other. They were built at different stages, showing that the site expanded over time. It was in use from the 6th to the 11th century, and it would have been a hive of activity. This was the home of an extended community who engaged in a range of activities. The people used the ring fort as a hub for food production, as well as light industry, like leatherwork and metalwork.
We found lots of metalworking evidence here, some metal artifacts like ring pins, rings, bracelet fragments, shears, knives, a full spectrum of metal artifacts that indicate that there was substantial activity in metalworking going on here.
This was the closest thing these people had to a business park or industrial estate. But they also used it for something else, a practice we don't normally associate with industry and manufacture. When the archaeologists excavated to the southeast, they discovered something unexpected. Hidden beneath the soil were bones, human bones.
Ranelagh turned out to be a very significant graveyard. Initially, we indicated about 12 skeletons were there, but as we excavated and as the excavations went on, we found over 1,000 skeletons.
The main enclosure was used as a graveyard for the ordinary people of this area. From this place of death, the team salvaged extraordinary information about life in Ireland some 1,000 years ago. The bones were sent to Queen's University Belfast for analysis.
I specialise in osteoarchaeology, so that's the study of human skeletal remains. So I've been fortunate to be involved in a number of projects looking at medieval burial grounds in Ireland over the years. One of the most recent of these was the Ranelagh burial ground in County Roscommon. The site at Ranelagh seems to be a settlement cemetery, so you've got secular activities going on as well as the burials. And I think it probably was what we call a ferta, so that would have been, you know, like an ancestral sort of maybe a burial ground in a particular region. So a community would have used it over and over again, you know, across the generations.
We archaeologists for decades and decades were basing all of our interpretations on the little bits and pieces, the traces that we find. The amount every year that breakthroughs in DNA research are contributing to the story and changing the story is unbelievable. You can tell so much more about who they were and where they came from, what kinds of diets they ate. We are in the constant process of rewriting the past, and DNA is playing a massive role in that.
Bone samples were sent to Trinity College Dublin for the DNA to be extracted and analysed. But getting DNA from bones that have lain in the earth for centuries is not a straightforward process.
There are special challenges in working with archaeological DNA because DNA with time breaks up and gets diluted by bacterial DNA and soil DNA and all sorts of different organisms. But it's still possible. If there's DNA left in a bone, which there isn't always, if there's DNA left from the original person, then it's possible to sequence it.
In a modern human, your genome is stored up quite neatly in 23 pairs of chromosomes. But when we try to get DNA from a bone sample, these chromosomes have been broken into millions and millions of really, really small pieces. So what we do is we have to extract all these tiny fragments and isolate them, and then we have to sequence them all of these tiny, tiny little pieces. What we basically do is try to piece them all back together to recreate the genome of this ancient person, like a very big jigsaw puzzle. Human genomes differ only a very, very small amount from one another. So I'd say it's sort of like having the jigsaw box that you already know what the picture should look like.
The team managed to solve the jigsaw, sequencing the DNA of several adults and children that were buried at Ranelagh. Their findings backed up the archaeologists' hunch that this was a closely knit community. But its members suffered all sorts of afflictions, and many died young.
In terms of the osteology, there were some really interesting features at Ranelagh. So one of them was a lot of children had died. There was a few of the burials were particularly poignant because, you could just sense the loss, of the living who buried the dead. So there was a little girl of about 7 and a half, 9 and a half, and she was buried with a younger boy. And we know the sex of these children through the DNA analysis because osteologically we would just say children. So that immediately sort of enriches our knowledge of these people.
The evidence suggests that mothers were often malnourished and that they kept their babies indoors to protect them. But lack of sunlight damaged their health. The people of Ranelagh had to contend with worse things than simple malnutrition. Lethal diseases also ravaged members of the community.
This is the skeleton of a young woman, so she would have been an adolescent when she died. Now, she had an atypical burial and she was sort of crouched. She was lying on her back. Her legs were pulled up towards her chest. And whenever we looked more closely at her skeleton, we could see she was absolutely ravaged with disease. This is her tibia, so her shin bone. And you can see, that surface should be very smooth and straight, just like here. But you can see there's this massive big cavity in it. And you can see it's all surrounded by kind of pitting and irregular bone. So that's a sign of massive infection. So her leg probably was very swollen, probably had, suppurating abscesses. So it would have been painful, smelly, and just very unpleasant for her. So she probably had a very poor quality of life before she died.
Of the hundreds of bodies uncovered at Ranelagh, most belonged to children and young people. Babies were particularly vulnerable. To die young was not uncommon at this time. Indeed, not many people lived past the age of 35 or 40. More than 1,000 years later, we can see the marks that hardship and affliction left on these people. And yet, they are not the most intriguing thing about this medieval ring fort. Although the remains found here date from early Christian times, they regularly show evidence of pagan practices. In traditional Christian burial, the deceased are placed on their backs, facing east towards the rising sun, to symbolize resurrection. But at Ranelagh, not all of the dead received this treatment.
For the most part, people would have been buried in ring forts in the supine position, so lying on their backs with their heads to the west, looking at the rising sun. On occasion, we see variations of those unusual burials where people are buried in different ways. In Ranelagh, we had one individual, a woman, who was buried with her knees crunched up to her chest in a very compact burial. We also had some burials where the bodies were buried with their faces to the ground. We're not quite sure what those were about. The kind of common thinking is that this was some sort of a slight on the body, where they were being disrespected in some way. Maybe they weren't part of the community, or maybe they were outsiders who had died during battle.
Another burial signalled that two male members of the community had an unusually close relationship.
One particular burial at Ranelagh was of two men buried together with their arms around each other. And it may be a simple situation that these men were close friends in life. We know that they were close age when they were buried.
A young adult male, and he was buried alongside an adolescent boy. So the boy was about sort of 16, so, you know, he's an older teenager. And again, they were sort of wrapped around each other. They were both sort of looking into each other, and they're sort of lying slightly face downwards. But whenever you looked at the positioning of the arms, they were again sort of fully embracing.
DNA analysis showed that the two males were distant relatives, and it's possible they were foster brothers. Fosterage was common practice in medieval Ireland, and foster brothers could be very close. But there may also be another explanation.
We do have to sort of pose the question, you know, maybe there was a sexual aspect, you know, maybe they were lovers. And we get accounts again that sort of suggest, you know, there was homosexuality in early medieval Ireland. Now, a lot of the information comes in church records, so like the penitentials, and it's usually, you know, dealing out punishments. But the punishments seem to be quite minor, so I think society probably was reasonably relaxed about homosexuality, and that the church was just trying to sort of impose some sort of control.
The discoveries suggest this society was only loosely controlled by the church. The people who lived and died here had their own traditions and practices. But even still, the archaeologists were shocked by the next grave they excavated.
There was one child, one young boy between 7.5 and 9.5 years old. He was decapitated in what is, you know, quite a violent fashion. As far as we've been able to ascertain, the youngest in Ireland at the time who had been decapitated in this way.
This is the remains of the 7.5 to 9.5-year-old boy. So you can see this is the second, third and fourth neck vertebra, and you can see a clean cut here through the back of the vertebra. And the second one also has evidence of nicks, you know, caused by the sharp weapon. And they've extended to the side of his mandible as well. So he probably had his head tightly bent forward and was, you know, hit from behind. We interpreted this as formal execution, and because the cuts were pretty severe, you can see that there's actually again a cut right across his mandible, and you can see little nicks at the back. So that probably all happened in a number of blows.
Children were very heavily protected under the laws of the time. To do this kind of violence to a child would have been, you know, would have drawn a very severe penalty from the lawmakers of the time.
This is a very extreme act. What would have caused a young boy to be executed? I think it's perhaps something to do with getting to the adults in his life as a way, you know, of really hurting them by killing a child.
We have no way of knowing, to be honest with you. But the burial right he was afforded was, you know, in the normal tradition, obviously with a lot of love by his family, or a greater quantity of grave goods in with him than it would have been normally.
A decapitated child. People buried face down. Two men lying in a close embrace. these burial practices suggest a culture that can only be guessed at. The early medieval people had many traditional beliefs that the church did not sanction. And supernatural places and creatures haunted their dreams. A short distance north of Ranelagh lies an ancient site that is one of the strangest in Ireland. Some believe it to be an entrance to the other world.
And it's known as Oinagat, or the Cave of Cats. It was described as, from a Christian perspective, it was described as a mouth to hell. This notion of the otherworld itself as a concept is something that we see portrayed in different ways. Sometimes it's an underworld realm, and in others it's almost seen like a space that surrounds our space. It's sort of in parallel to it, and you can only sort of tap into it in certain places in certain times.
It's regarded as being an entrance place, not as a Doris Hiffer and a Heron or a gate to hell, but actually as an entrance place to the other world.
Some of those who enter the cave feel they are on not only a physical threshold, but a threshold between two worlds. Such feelings are heightened by the cave's unusual appearance. A narrow fissure through the ground, enclosed by limestone walls that look almost like the ribs of a giant creature. Ancient tales say that during Samhain, the great festival of the dead, the gate to the other world opens.
Samhain is the point in time in which we see the liminal time between autumn and winter. It's the changeover from the time of harvest and into the time of coldness, of deadness, of lack of growth.
The old tales say that during the days between autumn and winter, a set of supernatural monsters, beasts and demons emerged from the cave.
We have stories of the war goddess, the Morriachan, coming out of there on Halloween and riding around on her chariot at this great festival of Samhain, this juncture point between summer and winter, and the time when the other world was closest to our world.
There are stories of giant cats, werewolves, three-headed monsters, and huge wild boars that cause chaos on the landscape. With the coming of Christianity, the church attempted to assimilate the Cave of Cats into the new religion. Around the 9th century, the church claimed that the cave was not a gateway to the pagan otherworld, but the entrance to the Christian underworld, to hell.
Another story from medieval literature talks about Nera, who is a warrior who goes into the underworld, to this place, and he finds himself not in a dark cave under the ground in Roscommon, but instead finds himself in a beautiful sunny environment, and there's flowers growing there that only grow in spring and in summer. And when he eventually comes out of there, he brings these spring flowers and summer flowers out and presents them to the king and queen as proof that he had been in the other world. Time moves differently there as well. He spends what seems like a year there, and only a couple of hours have passed in the real world.
Irish folklore contains many stories of people who die and then come back. For whatever reason, they are not content to go across to the next life. Perhaps because they still have business in this one. Archaeology shows how this belief influenced burial practices during the Iron Age, long before the coming of Christianity.
There are a couple of examples of bog bodies. These are bodies that are found preserved in the bog, evidence of having been physically tied to the ground. The man that was found in Gala in County Galway had two shafts of wood that were stuck in either side of him, and the idea was that these were to bind him to the ground. In Old Croghan, he had piercings through his biceps where they put ropes through, and it's thought that they were for physically restraining him to the ground. So the implication is you don't tie them down unless you think they're going to get up.
We have evidence from a number of different bog bodies that, well, the general interpretation is that they were ritual killings and that they were intentionally put into the bog and in some cases restrained or weighed down with stones because they were powerful beings and thus in danger of coming back or, causing havoc in people's lives. I imagine that as Christianity took hold in Ireland, that the occasional not quite dead yet person climbing out of a grave and terrorizing people would have kept the belief alive that some people were susceptible to coming back from the dead.
Chris Reid has found fascinating evidence to confirm that this belief persisted in Christian times. Some years ago, Chris investigated a forgotten cemetery near Lough Key and made a shocking discovery. He brought the remains to his college laboratory for analysis.
We had a number of interesting burials that you would classify as deviant burials. What we mean by deviant is not that the people were deviant, but that the burial itself, in terms of some of its characteristics, deviates from the norm. Two most interesting one of those includes one of the individuals we have laid out in front of us here.
It was clear that the burial was anything but Christian. Each of the skulls had a large stone inserted in its mouth.
The jaw was propped open, and this was intentionally set in quite solidly. There's no question that it fell into the mouth or anything like that. It was very definitely positioned into the mouth. And the burial beside it had an even larger stone, this one much more angular, wedged into the mouth, and is so large that it would have dislocated the jaw to make it fit, basically. They were both clearly inserted after the individuals had died. There's no indication that this was done while they were living.
This is one of the few instances where archaeologists have discovered human skulls with large stones in their mouths. To Chris Reid, it suggests a strange and powerful ritual.
When somebody dies, their spirit, their soul, leaves their body with their last breath. And the mouth is the orifice through which that happens, right? That is where your soul escapes and will then rise up to heaven. So this mouth is sort of a dangerous kind of liminal part of the body in that it's a portal. And the fear was that if somebody wasn't ready to be dead yet, that their soul would be restless and could try to get back inside the body. And thus blocking the mouth would have been a way to keep that from happening. The other thing would be that somebody could be considered susceptible to possession by an evil spirit or something like that, and thus the mouth would be blocked.
There is a tradition in Europe which seems to go right back to do with the idea of burying certain people in a particular way, which seems to imply that you don't want them to rise again.
In a Viking grave in Denmark, the body of a woman was treated even more strangely. Those who buried her placed two large boulders directly on top of the body, almost certainly because they thought she would rise from the dead. They may have feared that the woman was a sorceress with supernatural powers. Were the Lough Key men also feared as supernatural beings? Or is there another explanation?
We know, for example, there's a 5th century graveyard in Italy, so a couple of hundred years before these Irish burials, where there was a young girl who had a stone shoved in her mouth in the very same way. And the thinking was that it was perhaps a plague grave. Perhaps they believed that the dead would rise either physically or sort of in spiritual form, and that they would spread disease in this way. Perhaps it is the case that these Irish guys, they had disease, or perhaps for whatever reason, maybe they were murder victims or suicides, that they needed to be treated in this different way.
These bizarre discoveries bring home how little we know about what people believed 1,000 years ago. In medieval Ireland, Denmark and Italy, and across Europe, people had their own ways of interpreting and rationalizing the world. Practices that seem strange to us today may have been perfectly logical to them. One thing is certain. Medieval culture was rich and complex, and we have only just scratched its surface. But new techniques and technologies have already given archaeologists and scientists more knowledge than they can have hoped for even a decade ago. Without doubt, in the future, further fascinating discoveries will be made.